While since I was in your class, but it's certainly a pleasure to be back this evening. And I see many faces that I recognize, and I see many names that I recognize. And yeah, it's good to be there. Hopefully, we will not lose the opportunity to have this kind of meeting even when the corona crisis is fully past. We in the Netherlands are about to come out of a full lockdown, maybe, or probably in about a week. We can do most of the things again that we were used to doing. This morning I preached again in a service, a physical service, in a small church, but it was almost back to normal. People tried to keep still 1.5 meters distance, social distance, but I must admit they were not very successful. Well, tonight then, I'm going to talk about the difference between European Adventism and American Adventism. Is there such a difference? If so, in what way? Or are there more similarities than differences? Let's have a look at that. And from the outset, I should say, there is no such a thing, of course, as American Adventism, and there is no such a thing as European Adventism. So it's a very broad generalization. And the differences within the Europe are certainly very, very significant, maybe even more significant than some of the differences between us Europeans and others in the United States. Well, let me share my screen. Here we go. So how European is European Adventism, and does it differ from American Adventism? I assume you can see my screen. Your Adventism, of course, is very pluriform. That is true of Adventism worldwide. There are many different streams and many different modalities, as we would call them. Wherever we go, there are influences of historical circumstances, geographical circumstances, isolation, yes or no, cultural backgrounds, etc. And as far as I know, what I know of American Adventism, and I think I know a little bit about it. My wife and I, we have lived in the United States twice. Once when I studied for my master's at Andrews University, but that is ancient history. More recently, in the early 1990s, as I was working in the Mission Institute at Andrews University. And of course, I've had the privilege of going very often to the United States and visiting, well, of course, not all of your states, but a good number of them. So I think I have some idea of what American Adventism is like, and know something about the diverse streams and modalities, something about the difference, and that is very general again, between East Coast Adventism and West Coast Adventism, some of the differences between large urban institutional churches and the small rural churches, and then, of course, also about the ethnic churches in regions where you have many members and where people can find a church that consists mostly of people of their own culture. So yes, pluriformity of Adventism worldwide and in the United States. There is certainly also an enormous amount of pluriformity in European Adventism. And that is partly determined by, for instance, history. And even today, you can still find out how Adventism originated in the various countries. Where, that's one of the questions, did the pioneers come from? Did they come from the United States, as for instance in Britain, where most of the pioneers came from the US? In some of the other European countries, they came also from the US, because they were Danes or Norwegians or Germans who had migrated to America. And then when there was interest in Europe, some of the people with that background went back to preach the gospel, as they called it, to their own people back home. But there are also places in Europe where they were much influenced by the German missionaries that came to their countries. And for instance, in the Netherlands, in the beginning of our church in the Netherlands, about 120 years ago, we were heavily influenced by those who came from Germany. And many of our pastors, for a long time, until the Second World War even, were Germans. So where did the pioneers come from? That was a basic question that determined to some extent the way the church would go in particular places. The administrative structures that were formed also had a large influence on how certain Adventism in certain countries developed, and I'll come back to that a little later. And then you can find that the original or the main religious climate in various churches had a great influence. In mainly Protestant countries, Adventism developed somewhat differently from Adventism in mainly Roman Catholic countries, and maybe even some difference between Lutheran countries and Calvinistic countries. Now, a case in the Netherlands, for instance, was mainly Calvinistic. And I think that even today, you find that there are some elements of Calvinism that are visible in Dutch Adventism. So these are some of the factors that influenced the pluriformity of European Adventism. But the pluriformity of present-day European Adventism is certainly not made less by the complexity of Europe that you find today, the cultural complexity, but also the political complexity. Europe, we talk about Europe, and we often talk about the European Union with its today 27 member states. But we should not forget that actually in Europe there are 51 different nation states. Now, some are pretty small. Vatican City is probably the smallest, but some are larger: Germany, France, Italy, Spain. 51 of them, with different setups, different histories, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe. And anyone who has traveled in Europe knows that there's quite a bit of difference between Southern Europe and Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe. Well, Eastern Europe is somewhat of a difficult term nowadays, and many of the countries that we used to call Eastern, they like to be called Central European countries now. countries like the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Slovenia, these countries, Poland, Hungary, they'd like to be called Central Europe rather than Eastern Europe today. Political influences have played a major role also in the way the church developed. For instance, the influence of Germany was different before World War II and after World War II. Whereas the Netherlands Union was part of the German Union before World War II and was part of the same division. After the war, there was a separation, and the Netherlands now belonged to a different division, and there was hardly any contact with Germany. There were long periods of isolation for some of the countries behind the Iron Curtain, difficult to have connections with the world church. And then we must not forget that the ethnic composition of Europe does not always follow national borders. And sometimes you find people of one particular ethnicity outside of the country that is now home to most of the people of that ethnicity. Take, for instance, Hungary. Many Hungarians that live in the neighboring countries across the Hungarian border. And that's true for a number of other countries. There is the linguistic complexity, of course. And those of us who live in Europe, we had better speak more than one language, because as we travel all the time, we need to have the knowledge of at least one or two other languages. That's certainly true for people who live in the Netherlands or who live in Scandinavia, etc. You know, people in Europe in general, they are not going to learn Danish or Norwegian or Dutch, but they will like to speak English to us, so we must learn English. To have some German is also quite good. In the past, French was more of an important language than it is today, but there are so many different languages in that certainly makes it complex. Germanic languages, the Roman languages, like Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, but there are also some other languages, and if you have ever seen any Hungarian, then you will realize that or Finnish, that those are languages that it's only for the elect who are able to learn and converse in those languages. True also for the Estonian language, which is very similar to Finnish. Well, I think it's similar, although they themselves do not think so. And then you have the Albanian language. So all these languages, that's really complex. And sometimes you have several languages in one and the same country. Take Switzerland, has 4 official languages. And even Finland has 2 official languages, Finnish as well as Swedish. So it's complex. Now, there has always been an influence of American Adventism to European Adventism. Of course, in general, America was a model for other parts of the Western world, their products, their gadgets, entertainment in particular, and English, that became the lingua franca of the Adventist Church, even though, surprisingly, there are still quite a few countries where even most of the pastors do not master English. But by and large, English has become important for the Adventist Church. English literature, particularly also the writings of Mrs. White. Influence from America also because many of the European leaders and some of the pastors were educated in the United States, went to Andrews in particular, or some went to Oakwood College or to some of the other universities in the United States. America's political role has been important. We look towards America for many of the things and for our security. And of course, the American president does not get tired to remind us that we should actually be willing to pay a little more for our security and not let America foot the bill like we have been used to doing. Influence of American Adventism also, because many of the church's leaders, General Conference people, they used to, in pre-COVID times, travel the world and visit us and bring us the unadulterated gospel. And then you have the influence of the church's administrative structure, the policies, even the nomenclature. You know, we have a church that has presidents. Now in Europe, no church has presidents. They have other titles for the chief officer of their church. And in fact, in most European Protestant churches, the general secretary is the #1 administrative officer and not the president. But we have taken over the nomenclature, conferences, unions, presidents, etc. And in many of the procedures and the way we have structured our meeting places and so on, we have seen the American influence. And there has been, and to some extent is, the influence of finances. Even today, some finances come from the United States, from the General Conference. Now, of course, the finances of the General Conference come from all over the place, but it's experienced as the Euro-Africa division. Well, it's called the Inter-European division now. They get a subsidy from the United States, from the General Conference, of over $1 million or so a year. And I believe that for the Trans-European division, it's between $2 and $3 million. I'm not totally sure about the exact figures now, but that is what it used to be when I was involved in the church's administration. So when you look at how the church is organized in Europe, you see there are 3 divisions. Now, some would not count the 3rd one as a European division, and certainly the Euro-Asia division, most of its territory is far away and is beyond the Caucasus, and so would not be counted as European, but certainly there is a European part of that division. But we're talking in particular about the Trans-European division with its 11 unions, and then its membership, only 90,000, the smallest division in our world church. And of course, when you look at that, there are some conferences, there are quite a few conferences actually elsewhere in the world that have more members than the Trans-European division. The EUD, now, you know, it's strange when the Euro-Africa division existed, it was called EUD for some reason. And when the name was changed to Inter-European division a number of years ago, the abbreviation EUD was not changed. The EUD also has 11 unions. Its membership is about double of that of the Trans-European division, but that is to a large extent due to the fact that Romania is part of that division, and that is the largest union in Europe. Here you have a map of the TED. And I don't know how good your geography is, but one of the first things that strikes you when you look at that is that it doesn't seem very logical the way the church is structured in Europe. You have on the left there, top left, Iceland. Well, in reality, it's not quite as big as it is on this map. Iceland, the Iceland Conference, is part of the Trans-European Division. So is Ireland and Great Britain. Then you move over a little bit and you see the Netherlands, Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and then across from the Botnic Gulf, Finland. You go below Finland, you see the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, in the middle, Latvia, the 3rd one, Lithuania. Then the big place in the middle, Poland. And then when you go a little further south, you see Hungary. And then all the countries that used to be part of Yugoslavia, also with Albania, and just dropping off the slide is Greece. And so that is all part of the Trans-European Division. Now, it has been configured differently in the past. Trans-Europe also cared for some other territories in the past when it was called the Northern Europe West Africa Division. Then the countries in West Africa, notably Ghana and Nigeria, they became part of the African divisions. For a long time, Poland was part of the Trans-European Division, or Northern European Division, as it was called for some time. But then it seemed like in the days of the Cold War, in the days of the Iron Curtain, it was thought that maybe the 2 European divisions would share some of the challenges connected with the countries at the other side of the Iron Curtain. And so that is why Poland was part of the Trans-European Division. Somewhat later, it was decided that the Baltic countries, when the Iron Curtain fell apart, the Baltic countries, they very much wanted to become part of the same division as Scandinavia. They felt that they really are more Scandinavian than they are Slavic, and they belong to Eastern Europe. So they wanted to come to Trans-Europe, which was, they came as 3 conferences in the Baltic Union. Hungary had been part of the other division in Europe, but there had been long-lasting challenges in Hungary. There had been a secession by a significant number of people. And so it was then decided that maybe let's try whether the combination with Trans-Europe works better than the existing one. So Hungary came over to Trans-Europe. And some of the same reasons were for the former Yugoslavia. And I remember in the days when I was the secretary of the Trans-European Division to be heavily involved with some of the issues there in reorganizing the territories of the former Yugoslavia and dealing with Albania that opened up, etc., etc. So it's a very complicated map, but this is the Trans-European Division administered from Britain, St. Albans, not far from London. And this then is the map of the EUD, that is the Inter-European Division. And you see that is slightly more homogenic, it's Germany, France, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, and then below Germany you have Switzerland, Italy, Czech Republic, Slovakia, let me see, right over to the right, you have Romania, the largest union, and Bulgaria. And yeah, I forgot Austria. Yes, my wife is correcting me. And, you know, sometimes, not very often, but I need to be corrected. So thank you. Now, this seems a little bit more logical than the Trans-European division. But, you know, consider the Netherlands. We are on the south, Belgium, on the right, eastern side, there is Germany. We are very close culturally and in many other ways to these countries. But our church has virtually no contact with the churches, in particular in Germany. Belgium, it's partly Dutch is one of the languages, but officially Belgium is part of the other division. And if they want to invite me to come and speak in Brussels, and I can drive to Brussels within 2.5 hours, but then the Belgian conference will have to send an application to Bern in Switzerland, to the headquarters office of the Inter-European Division. And they will have to send that application on to St. Albans. And St. Albans will have to send that on to the headquarters of the church in the Netherlands. And then the invitation reaches me. And of course, the event for which I had been invited is long history by that time. So we have decided, we did that some time ago, just simply to ignore these rules and to deal with that kind of thing between Belgium and the Netherlands directly. And there is quite a bit of contact between those two countries. Also because a part of Belgium is Dutch speaking. But we have very, very little contact with Germany. We used to be part of the German Union before the Second World War. Now we are in different divisions and we don't meet our German brethren at meetings. They have their own meetings, we have our own meetings. And one wonders whether this is not somewhat that is really something of the past, and we really need to do something about it. This is then the ESD, and that is a huge division. And we can see that there is a lot of work to be done, because when you look at the number of members in this vast territory, that is really, what is it, 110 or 130,000 members in all of this. And we virtually have little contact or no contact with that division. Sometimes educational meetings, people from Russia and from of the other nations that border on Europe, they will attend, but for the rest of the division, they are on their own. So this is how complicated the situation is in Europe. The complexity becomes even greater because of the migration that we have had the last half century from outside of Europe. People from former colonies have come to live amongst us. Now, of course, you have something similar in the United States, but maybe not quite to the same extent, and maybe it's not quite as complicated as this. Now, Indonesia used to be a Dutch colony. We are gradually phasing up to the fact that we were actually not that pleasant colonizers as our parents and grandparents prided themselves to be. Many people from Indonesia have come to live in the Netherlands. Many people from Ghana, Zambia, Zimbabwe have come. Ghana all over Europe, Zambia, Zimbabwe, in particular, Great Britain. People from Congo, Rwanda, and North Africa. They came in particular to the French-speaking countries. People from the Caribbean to the United Kingdom. And increasingly in the last 2-3 decades, we see Portuguese churches springing up all over Adventist Europe because of immigrants who have come from Brazil and have come to live and work in Europe. So people coming from outside to Europe, but also migration inside of Europe. When you look at the membership in Spain, for instance, it is double that of 25, 30 years ago. But actually, there are now more Romanian Spanish Adventists than there are Spanish Adventists. Italians have moved around, people from Poland have moved around. People from Romania Adventists from Romania have moved to many different countries. And actually membership in Romania has gone down considerably because of the loss of membership, members going elsewhere. And an important move has been German-speaking Russians who were welcomed into Russia, into Germany. But in many cases, these people brought their own cultures with them, and that has not been without problems. Well, this is something about the complexity of Adventism in Europe. I think before we try to give an overview of the similarities and differences, we must ask the question, does the church in Europe go through a crisis? And fairness, honesty demands that we say yes, in many ways it does. We see that in the world around us, that in general there is a degree of church involvement. There is a degrees in membership and certainly church attendance in Protestantism, and certainly also in Roman Catholicism. And if Roman Catholicism was seen as the great enemy in the past, when you look at their development at present in Europe, and certainly in countries like the Netherlands, then it's difficult to see them as a major enemy, because they are really getting a battering. In our church, we have seen from the 1960s, 1970s onwards, very slow growth. Traditional evangelism has failed, and very few alternatives have really worked. There has in most of the unions, most of the countries in Europe, been a significant decrease in the number of church workers. And of course, most of my, or at least I know the situation best in my own country. And today we have twice the number of members that we had when I started as a pastor. And we have half the number of pastors that we had at that time, or even less. A decrease in number of church workers in most of the countries in Europe. Finances, when you look at the figures, then you see that in actual numbers, income has steadily risen in most countries in the Adventist Church in Europe. But when you look at inflation, and when you look at per capita giving, then you see why we cannot afford to pay more ministers than we do, because finances did not keep up with inflation. Many institutions over time have closed. Some of you may know the famous health institution that we had in Denmark, Skodsborg. It was the flagship institution. It's still a magnificent building. When you drive along the coastal road, It's on the same island where Copenhagen is located. When you drive along that road, you see that magnificent building, and you think, well, that once belonged to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But many other institutions, schools, publishing houses, and health institutions had to close. And there has been, I think it's fair to say, quite a bit of discouragement. You know, church membership has gone up in those countries where there was migration, where large numbers have come from elsewhere, from the former colonies, like in Britain, like in France, in the Netherlands to some extent, in Belgium, where large numbers have come, there the membership has actually gone up. But some countries did not have colonies in the past, like, for instance, the Scandinavian countries. And so, yes, there has been an influx of foreigners to these countries, but not many members, Adventist Church members. And so, for instance, when you look at Denmark, the church membership has continuously gone down for the last 25 years. There has not been 1 year when actually membership has gone up. And when you have a situation like that, and there are other countries with similar experience, then of course there is widespread discouragement. And I think it's fair to say that we are very uncertain as to what the COVID-19 situation has done to the church and will do to the church. What will the church be like when we emerge from that? So, yes, call it a crisis. Maybe you would just like to call it difficulties of challenges, but challenges there certainly are. Well now, and I see the clock is ticking, so we must come to the differences and the similarities between the church in the USA and in Europe. Europe is highly secularized. And one of the things that we have seen is well, I call it demise here on my slide. Maybe that's too strong a word, but the disintegration of organized religion. To give you an example, the Archbishopric of Utrecht in the Netherlands used to have about 200 parishes. Today, it has less than 50 parishes. And prognosis is that by the year 2030, so that's not that far away, there may be just 25 parishes in that archbishopric. And that is a picture that you see in many different places also. And it's also true for most of the Protestant churches that they have great difficulty in maintaining their membership, and many are actually losing members quite significantly. There was, when the borders opened up after the disappearance of the Iron Curtain, there was a moment when there was evangelism. There were opportunities to go into Eastern Europe and Central Europe. And there were lots of major, massive baptisms. And it's been a great disappointment that 10, 15 years later, many of those people that were baptized could no longer be found. And actually, these countries, former communist countries, they have not become religiously interested, religiously inclined countries to the extent that we hoped. But in fact, there are few countries that are as secular now as, for instance, the Baltic countries, in particular Estonia, or countries like the Czech Republic and some of the other places. So an intense secularization of Eastern and Central Europe. Now, I know America is also very secular, and there's also a decline of organized religion in many parts of the United States, for instance, in the North, in the Northwest, also in other places. But by and large, in comparison to what we find in Europe, America is still a very religious country. And that is, of course, also clear when you consider American politics. The way we view our church, the place of our church in the religious marketplace. In Europe, traditionally, many countries had, and some still have, a state church. Now, that doesn't mean the same kind of thing that it meant a century ago. And to a large extent, it's still, it's no more than a cultural thing for many people. 90 or more % of the Swedish people are still members of the Lutheran State Church. Actually, some Seventh-day Adventists remain members of the State Church, even after they have become baptized church members, Adventist church members, because that gives you the privilege of being buried in a very nice churchyard, aside one of these traditional little churches. But it's interesting, this is the background. State church, the established church in Britain, where actually the Queen is still the head of the church. Roman Catholicism, the majority church still in a number of countries, and Southeastern Europe, the Orthodox Church. Those were the main churches. And then you had the free churches, and they had, in Reformation times and the centuries after that, sometimes a hard time getting the same freedoms. They would now have the same freedom, often the same privileges, not always all the same privileges, but in many places, the free churches, those smaller churches, they still have a different status. Adventists, Pentecostals, some other groups, they're often viewed, certainly in the past, but in some places quite significantly still, as a sect or a cult. And it has also given many Seventh-day Adventists in Europe some kind of an inferiority complex, a negative self-image. They were small and insignificant, and they were not regarded as real legitimate churches, denominations. Whereas I know some of that applies to the United States, but you have the system of denominationalism. And much more than in Europe, Adventists have tended to see themselves as one of the many denominations. And as such, they have received much more respectability than they had for a long time in Europe. When you look at the American people, and I realize I'm getting on shaky ground, and I must be careful, and these are generalizations, but yet we can say that in general, Christians in the United States have tended, and I think even today tend to be much more optimistic about possibilities for the Christian church than European Christians are. In America, Arminianism, the idea of people having a free will, became more widespread even in originally Calvinistic churches than in many of the churches in Europe. And again, a generalization, but American religion is, first of all, practical and quite individualistic. One significant difference, when you look in particular also at Seventh-day Adventism, is that you find all kinds of independent ministries that flourish. And the phenomenon of independent ministries is far less common in Europe. It's much more difficult to start something that is accepted by the church in general, that is independent to a large extent from the official church. But in the United States, if people see a challenge, if they see something that needs to be done, the question is, what does it take to attack that problem? How many people do you need? How much money do you need? And let's start something. Let's begin an independent ministry. And of course, sometimes they are very much run as a money-making business. And this is not unknown in Europe, but much less common. We could say that America has exported many of its evangelists and evangelistic methods to Europe, whereas Europe has tended to export not evangelists, but theologians. For a long time, some countries in Europe dominated theology. Germany, Britain, Switzerland, but also the Netherlands. There has been a saying in the Netherlands that if you had one person, you had a theologian, one Christian, a theologian. You have two Christians, you have a church, and when you have three, you have a schism. But theology was something that it's difficult to say why it had such a success, why there were so many well-known theologians in these particular countries. But also in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, even from small countries, the Scandinavian countries, and from the Netherlands and from Germany, we have exported in the past many theologians to the United States, maybe less so today, but you see some of the names here, and you'll find there even a few from my country, like Hans La Rondelle. It's a French name, but he was very Dutch. I think his name indicates that his roots are from the Huguenots, people who came when they were persecuted for their faith and found a safe place in the Netherlands. Van Bemmelen, he's retired now, but he is still alive and lives at Andrews University. Gottfried Oosterwal, and you see Dederen came from Belgium. The church in America exported its evangelists, and the church in Europe, it seems, exported its theologians. Where are the differences when it comes to some politics and social issues? In the US, many Christians, evangelical Christians, many Seventh-day Adventists tend in their political sympathies to be towards the right. And many used to be, maybe less so today, Republican. Most countries in Europe, not all, but most countries have a multi-party system. a much greater spread of political ideologies. And that would be true also within the church. Now, I have no idea how most of the people in Europe vote in their national elections. Unfortunately, we have very few data on that. The data that we have for the Netherlands is that it's quite widespread, left, right, and in particular many at the center, and unfortunately some with distinctly right-wing ideas. But fortunately, not very many. There is not in the church the kind of debate on political issues that you find in the United States. And at least that's how I experience it, that when I'm in the United States or when I'm talking to my brothers and sisters in America, I must be careful because they may have totally different political ideas that are totally different from mine, and the discussion can become very quickly quite unfriendly and quite polarized. We do not, at least not in the context where I live, have the same kind of political debate in the church, among church members, that I've often found there to be in the United States. On social issues, most European Adventists welcome the fact that if they live in a country with a welfare state, they are happy that that is the case. And there are very few who are critical and say, this is socialist or even worse. Whereas I've been surprised when in the United States, I hear people talking about socialism and the kind of idea that they have about socialism. There is not that type of outlook on things here in at least the countries that I'm aware of. You take the issue of health insurance. That is so normal to have adequate health insurance or to have obligatory health insurance. There are very few, if any, people who question that. And so for many of us here in Europe, it's very difficult to understand the kind of debate there is about health insurance and everything connected with it. Support for minimum wages and other social programs. There would be very, very little criticism among the population in general, and certainly among Seventh-day Adventists. So that is quite a difference. And again, when associating with American Adventists, I need to always be careful and not show too much of my enthusiasm for what many would call socialism, etc. There's also, I think, a difference in the way we look at the separation between church and state. And many of us in Europe who know anything about the United States sometimes find the obsession, as we would tend to call it, in the US with total separation of church and state. We would not be able to really understand that. We are still quite happy with some involvement of the state, some supervision of the state, and the whole debate that there was some decades ago about prayer in public schools or religious symbols in public places, that we have found quite extravagant, quite exaggerated. And then the inconsistencies that we note. I remember being in the United States for the first time, going to an American Seventh-day Adventist church for the first time, and I wondered, what does the American flag do on the rostrum, on the podium? And so this kind of national symbol in the church service, is that not inconsistent when you want to have a total separation between church and state? And why can the president or the governor or whoever finish every statement, every speech with "God bless America"? That certainly doesn't seem like total separation of church and state. And have a chaplain in the Senate. I'm just mentioning a number of things. Well, of course, it's good that he is a Seventh-day Adventist, but what does a chaplain do in the Senate when there is total separation between church and state? And why does a president organize breakfast, prayer breakfast? I could go on and make the list longer. So this is something that many of us in Europe wonder about, this separation of church and state. By and large, in Europe, we are happy to accept government grants. If for our schools or even for some of our programs, if there are no direct ties attached to it, and we are free to spend it within particular guidelines, of course, it must be spent for a particular goal for which it is given, but we have no problem with accepting government grants. Now, I know in the States, things are moving. Andra has a few problems with accepting money from the government. And in the recent COVID corona situation, I noticed that several of our institutions have been willing to accept money from the government to tide them over the financial difficulties that they were seeing. But by and large, this has been an issue in the States that no, we are separate and we cannot accept money from the government. Whereas in Europe, we would be very happy to receive government subsidy as long as it would be within certain guidelines. The issue of non-combatancy. Gradually, I think it's true to say that there has been a gradual disappearance and turning away from our traditional standpoint. And there has been an acceptance of military service, either voluntary or as a career. Now, in theory, at least in Europe, Adventists still adhere to a much larger extent to the original idea of non-combatancy. It's not an issue now because there is no longer conscription in any of the European countries that I know of. There maybe also is the remembrance, the memory of how this issue about military service led to a significant church schism. In fact, the most important schism that Adventism has suffered in the time of the First World War and then reinforced in the Second World War. And the Reformed Adventist denomination that still exists reminds us of that. And in Europe, very few Seventh-day Adventists would choose a military career. Are there differences when it comes to lifestyle? Well, there is a wide difference as to how Adventists practice their religion in the US, from place to place, as well as in Europe. And so maybe the differences between different parts of Europe are larger than the differences in general between Europe and the United States. There are differences in the way people keep Sabbath. Well, that's true, of course, in the United States. In Europe, eating out on Sabbath is still not done in most places. And when the General Conference was held in Utrecht in 1995, many Dutch Adventists are still speaking about the fact that they saw Adventists all over town going to eat out. And this was a kind of Adventism they had not seen. For many Adventists in Europe, particularly Germany, Netherlands, spending money on Sabbath, that is the big question. You don't do that. When it comes to other areas, vegetarianism, there certainly was not the emphasis on vegetarianism in most parts of Europe when compared to the United States. But whether the differences are as big now, it's difficult to say. And vegetarianism in society at large has become more fashionable, and so has veganism. But probably still, vegetarianism is more widespread among major segments of American Adventism than it is in Europe. Wearing jewelry, it is a major issue in some of the churches that consists mainly of people who have come from elsewhere, from other cultures. But in the more indigenous part of the church, certainly in Western Europe, wearing of jewelry is not an issue that is often discussed. The Christmas tree, strangely enough, has been and still is, in some parts of Europe, a major issue. When I was a child, in the home in which I grew up, there was no Christmas tree. This was pagan. This was something that was not done by Seventh-day Adventists. And we had been taught so by the pastors who had come from Germany in particular. And there's still some lingering resistance against Christmas trees in some places among European Adventists. Divorce and remarriage, I'm not sure whether there is that much difference now between the US and the States. Probably there is with regard to cohabitation. In particular, when you look at Western Europe, some countries in Western Europe, where it has become the rule rather than the exception that young people live together for some time before getting married. Maybe somebody said the difference between cohabitation among American Adventists and European Adventists is that where in the US it is more as a preparation towards marriage. In Europe, in particular in Western Europe, it is more and more instead of marriage. But of course, then there are legal ways of making it look very much like marriage and like the kind of obligations and privileges that marriage brings. Well, I'm approaching the end of my PowerPoint, so just bear with me for a few more moments. What are the differences? Well, in evangelism, I don't think there are that many differences anymore. As far as evangelism is still being practiced, many influences from the US, the materials, often the speakers, and things like altar calls, which really do not belong to most of the European culture. I must admit, I always hated it when there was a foreign speaker coming to the Netherlands and having an altar call. Today, maybe parts of Europe are more open to experiment, church planting experiments, but there is a major influence of American independent ministries, and of course the internet knows of no borders, and YouTube films and CDs and what have you. They're finding their way all over the place, regrettably so in many cases. Finally, when we come to Ellen White, in the past, there was certainly, I think, a difference in that overall there was a lower profile for Ellen White in Europe. That was the influence of some historical occurrences, some historical figures, in particular the departure of Louis Conradi, who was a very powerful leader in Europe, but left the denomination. And his disagreement with Ellen White was part of the story. But most people in Europe were not able to read Ellen White in the original language. There were just a few books that were translated. And so the knowledge of Ellen White, access to her writings, was much more limited. Today, of course, many people know English. It's easier to look at things online, but there is a wide variety of viewpoints. And I would say that the situation resembles very much the USA. There are some people who prefer Ellen White over the Bible, and there are some who feel that it's about time that we stick to the Bible and pay less attention to Mrs. White. Same applies, I think, to prophetic interpretations. There is a wide variety of prophetic interpretations, traditional, etc., in the US, and that is also true in Europe. And the same kind of publications and messages from independent ministries, etc., from the fringe, they are also coming to Europe. So what is the future? I think the differences, if there are any, will be less along geographical lines. For many European Adventists, the inspiration will, maybe more than in the past, come from overseas, especially the influence of the powers, what do I call it, on the right. They may be more pronounced. The videos, the DVDs, 3ABN is having a major impact. Hope Channel, but less so, although there are local Hope Channel varieties that take on a lot of the material from the American Hope Channel, and unfortunately also a lot of the material from 3ABN. Organizations like Adventist Theological Society, conservative, have quite a bit of influence, and more so organizations like the General Youth Conference, not to forget Walter Veit, Amazing Facts with Doug Batchelor, etc. A lot of things on the fringes of Adventist. It must be feared that they will have a stronger and stronger influence. There's always more of a missionary spirit among people who like that, to share that with their friends, etc. But much of what we see in differences and factions in the United States, we will also see and continue to see in Europe. So are there differences between European Adventism and American Adventism? I've indicated that there are some, but maybe there are not as many as some people think. And in particular, the differences between groups of Adventists in Europe, they are certainly very significant. And maybe they will become more and more significant. Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry that I went a little late, Lauren, but let me stop my...
You were just fine, Doctor. You did just fine, and I'm not too worried about that. I've noticed that we have a lot of very devoted listeners here, and the number has actually increased while you were talking. So I think it was a fantastic presentation, and I'm very, very grateful to you for coming on and doing it. I see there are a few people with their hands up, and yet since I'm in charge, I get to ask the first question. You mentioned that European Adventism has been very much shaped by the immigrants that came in. For example, the Romanian Adventists. How did that change the complexion of congregations? Most of the Romanian Adventists, for example, that I've met here in the United States, and there are a few Romanian churches, brought a very fundamentalist sort of Adventism with them, and felt most comfortable with that. If you suddenly, and I have a friend in the British Isles whose church is nearly entirely Romanian, and he said they brought a certain kind of Adventism with them. I suspect the same is true in the UK, where you have churches that are formed largely of people who immigrated from the West Indies. So when people came into a new area and brought their own brand of Adventism with them, I would imagine that changed the local congregation. I would imagine it also probably began to change who was in the conference office and how they shaped the Adventism in their territory. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, you're right. When you have large numbers of people from a certain ethnicity or from a certain culture come into a particular region or come to a particular church, that when they become the majority, they tend to make it a church of their own. And that often happens because the others just go somewhere else or just disappear. And that is a very painful process. When you look at, for instance, the church in Greater Paris, or you look at a church in Greater London, there are hardly any in France, any French Seventh-day Adventists in the churches in Greater Paris. When you go to church on Sabbath in the main churches in Paris, they are only African or French Caribbean. We have, I don't know how many thousands of members in Greater London, maybe 4,000 or 5,000. There are some listeners who are from Britain, so they could correct me. But if there are more than 100 British Seventh-day Adventists in Greater London, that is it. So the composition of the church has greatly changed. And another example that I'm very well aware of, since in my retirement, I actually served there for a year and a half as their interim president in Belgium. We have 3,000 members. Originally, about half of our members was Dutch, Flemish speaking. Half of our members was French speaking. And in Brussels, they're supposed to speak both languages in theory. Today, we still have 2 or 3 Flemish-speaking churches, and we have a few French-speaking churches, but we also have And remember, it's only 3,000 members. We have some Spanish-speaking churches, Portuguese-speaking churches, people who speak the Ghanaian language, Twi, and have worship in Twi, have the language of Rwanda, so they have worship in their language. Then you have a number of Russian groups. You have, let me see, you have some, Portuguese. You have, well, there are a few more. So it's, and of course the Romanians, a number of major churches. And so now this is a country where you speak French and Dutch, but when we have our group of pastors together, we cannot have our meetings in either one of these languages, but actually English is the language that most are able to work with to some extent. So yes, that makes it very, very complicated. The church becomes much less cohesive. It becomes almost powerless in its outreach to the original indigenous population. And as you mentioned, there is also a visible or invisible struggle for power. Do we have the right number of people who have come from outside on our conference board, et cetera, et cetera? Mm-hmm. Now, on the other hand, in some of these countries, the fact that people have come from the outside has brought a new vitality to the church. At least something was happening. At least there was some growth. And whatever growth there is, that's always more exciting than a lack of growth. And although it's interesting that we like to speak of growth in our church to the extent that when we actually decrease, we still speak of growth. We have negative growth. So yeah, these are some of the dynamics that we find.
I mentioned Romanians really brought out a lot of comments in the chat, Reinder. The Romanian influence is very fundamentalist as a rule here in Canada. One person said Romanians have caused a lot of divisiveness in Germany. Another person said, another one wrote, my current and last two pastors are Romanian. I have essentially left that church. And another person said, we had a Romanian pastor years ago. He plunged our congregation into division over perfectionism and fringe eschatology and conspiracy theories the church emptied out. So I'm rather fascinated by that. I had only known a few Romanians, so I'm rather fascinated by how many comments this brought out, Reinder.
Yes, but I think we must have some empathy with them, in the sense that, you know, they have come in significant numbers, and more so to the countries where they speak a Romanian language than where they speak a Germanic language, because that is easier for them. And most of the people who have come are very industrious people, and they are very sacrificial people. And so they will sacrifice for their church, not only in terms of paying tithe, of giving tithe, but also they will in many places bend over backwards to have their own building and pay for that. When they bring a kind of Adventism with them that we left behind us 50 or 60 years ago. That's true.
Right.
But then they lived in isolation for such a long time. And also, as far as I know, the majority of Romanians who migrated, they come from rural areas in Romania, which are usually not the most progressive parts of the country. So then they come, they associate together, they bring the kind of Adventism, they are shocked by what they see, where they come, where they see a kind of Adventism that they feel has really left much of the fundamental principles of the church. And so they are insufficiently aware of the fact that in the meantime, while they cling to their fundamentalist kind of, and we're not talking about everybody, but by and large, while they cling to that, things in Romania are moving along, and there are many changes there. And so when they visit Romania, they often complain that it didn't used to be the way it was.
Interesting.
And that's true for many of the people who come from elsewhere as well, that they have that dilemma.
Very interesting. Yeah, most of the comments here had to do with theology, nothing else. I'm sure there are a lot of churches that were happy to be saved by the influx of new Adventists.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be turning here to Robert Johnston. Robert, would you join in on this conversation?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for a fascinating presentation. That was really interesting. We have some stereotypes of what European Adventists are, but you've blown some of those and given us a lot more complexity, which is useful. I live in Texas. We've actually gone through much of what you've described in the years I've been here, which has been since 1981. Texas went from a predominantly Anglo and English-speaking state to one in which we have, essentially a Spanish-speaking majority now. And in the church, that's very much been the case. The constituency and nominating committee compositions have changed pretty dramatically in the last 20 years, as has the leadership of the conference. And within the Houston area, for example, which is where I live close to, I think the population is somewhere in the 5 million range now. And within the loop highway that goes around the city, it's probably been 20 years ago since that we lost the last English-speaking church within that loop. Mm-hmm. And so very much been a change that way. And yes, it does change the dynamics of the congregations as that all shifts. But actually, that's just a comment. What I wanted to ask you about was progressive Adventism, because I think this is a more general a question, maybe of more general interest. My perception is that progressive Adventism is sort of a luxury, a product of institutional Adventism, something that can't really thrive outside of institutional Adventism. And so maybe I'm wrong on that, but if there's any truth to that, I wonder if it can even survive as finances and membership and so on decline to the point that institutions can no longer be supported. You mentioned losing a hospital. Of course, we lose, educational institutions and so forth as well. And I see the right as being much, as you mentioned, much more evangelistically minded, but progressivism maybe not so much so. So if the European Adventists, at least not counting the immigrants coming in, are predominantly of more of a progressive mindset, it doesn't seem like it paints a very positive picture, but for the future, but we face the same challenges here as well. So just your thoughts on whether progressive Adventism can grow, or if it has to have conservative Adventists sort of feeding it, both financially and as well as people who eventually sort of grow out of that and become more progressive in their thinking.
That's a question that I find very difficult to answer. I continue to be optimistic. But on the other hand, unfortunately, there are signs that in some places in Europe that used to be, some regions that used to be more what you call progressive, they're actually losing influence, and that many of our leaders play it safe and cater more for the influence or for the demands of the more conservatives. And of course, that's easy to really fall into that trap. And when I had any influence in some places, I always tried not to. And you know, even now, being retired and not in the center of things, people like me, we can still have some influence. We don't have to be stupid and say the things we want to say all the time to everyone in whatever way we feel. You have to use common sense and try to be a little smart about it. But I have felt that even though being open and speaking my mind and showing my colors, as it were, it closes doors, but it also opens doors. And I'm always surprised to find that people tell me, or I hear via other channels, that they feel it's important that that kind of progressive sound is also heard. And that gives me hope that there are more people maybe than we think, you know, that there are at least 7,000 that have not knelt before the Baal. But unfortunately, as I indicated, people who are more on the extreme conservative side, they want to preach their gospel. They are also willing to invest money in publications and in all kinds of activities, and they often are also the best tithe payers. Mm-hmm. Now, when I look at the country where I live, I think that the leaders are quite middle of the road, but somewhat more conservative than maybe in the past. And that has helped tithe income in the country. And of course, that always speaks loudly. I feel that what we really need is that there is much more openness. And, you know, places like Adventist Today, Spectrum, other places, they have very significant role. But I wished also that our regular publishing houses, they would be willing to be a little bit more daring. And our leaders would be a little bit more daring and not just put their foot on the brake when they see something that worries them. But yeah,
there does seem to be not a lot of courage in the official church publications, which is why some of us have continued to thrive right now. And it's also rather sad, Reinder, that it ends up making it look like Adventist Today and Spectrum and others are anti-church. Mm-hmm. In reality, what we're trying to do is speak that part of Adventism that the church refuses to speak. Yeah. Yeah. And we don't really want that role in a way. I mean, but the church has pretty much wrapped up the market on apologetics. Mm-hmm. It's pretty much all that you see nowadays. And so then we stand out here and say, yeah, but ask questions and what about this? What about this? And they say, oh, you rebels. And in a way, it's not really rebellious. It's sometimes just balancing the scales, perhaps a bit.
And I still hope that the pendulum will swing back.
I do.
And it has to, because more and more people are asking questions.
Right. Right. I'm going to move on to my friend Jeffrey Marshall. Jeffrey, I think you're already unmuted, so go ahead.
Thank you very much, because I have to leave pretty quickly as well. I really appreciated the presentation, and I also really appreciated what Dr. Bruinsma said about how the Romanians and other persons are reflecting what was taught to them by the missionaries coming back. I mean, I can say from experience, a lot of those things coming in is what was taught, you know, what you're getting from. And so what I would suggest as a comment is that those who want to help to fight back against that legalism, because there's nothing wrong with being progressive or conservative, but the legalism is a bad thing. You have to be more evangelical. You have to reach out some more. So my two questions related to that are, what plans are there in these three divisions for evangelism to reach those secularized Europeans and natives, and especially like in the Eastern European division, I saw the areas like Afghanistan, Tajikistan, you know, those centralized countries where there's absolutely no Christian presence, much as Adventist presence. What plans do the divisions have to reach those? And secondly, given that now the majority of the members are immigrants, is this reflected in the leadership, the conference leadership? Like if all the pastors are Romanians, where are the native pastors? You know, where are those pastors will be coming into? That might help in that regard, because they're filling a gap that's not there. So what plan is there for the conference leadership to reflect the membership that is there? And if there's a gap, is that similar to the reason for the gap that might be that you see in the USA? That's my comment and two questions.
Okay. The last question is maybe the easiest. And usually the pattern is that there is some resistance initially in making the composition of the government structure more representative. It takes a while before the leadership of the church is ready to go that way. And then it is more or less forced upon them very often by changing circumstances. Now, for instance, historically in the United Kingdom, Britain, there was actually intervention from the General Conference necessary to say, hey, wait a minute, you now have so many people from the Caribbean, you need to invite some Caribbean pastors, and you need to make sure that at least one of the officers in a conference and in the union is from that group. Now, gradually, I think in most of the places that I'm aware of, there is a readiness to accept a variation, or well, what is the word that I want to, a representation of leaders from the main ethnic groups and cultural groups. But it does not always make, of course, for a homogeneous governing body. One of the things that I very much wonder about is what the last year has done to the structure of our church. And I have a sense that in many ways the higher bodies, as we call them in the church, have lost a lot of their influence.
I agree.
And whether that is good or not, you know, there would be different opinions. I tend to think that may be not such a bad idea, that the church has become probably more local. Mm-hmm. Now, whether there are plans for evangelism, I think that I'm not aware of any really innovative plans. Yes, there are documents produced from time to time which call for a more a greater alignment with what the questions are in society, but it doesn't translate, as far as I have seen, in anything substantial. Like, you know, the big appeal to do something about the major cities of the church, it hasn't really brought anything significant as far as I'm concerned. And for Europe, and probably this would be true for major part of the United States as well. The newcomers, as it were, they were for some time able to evangelize among their own group quite successfully. But that is no longer the case. Many of them are now second generation, and many of their group have now settled to the extent that that kind of growth is no longer there to the same extent. The kind of growth that we must expect, that we must nurture, is people will come to our communities if they are welcoming communities, and if they're places where people feel at home.
Yeah.
And it's like, you know, Richard Rice, I think, wrote the book Belonging Before Believing. People want to belong somewhere. And it's a long process maybe before they are what we call truly Adventists. Okay, that may be so, but it's only when a church is truly open and welcoming, and where people have a certain amount of freedom, where they can thrive, and that is the place where people will come and feel that can be their spiritual home. That is, I would believe, the hope.
Well, Ellen White also said the best argument for the gospel is a loving and lovable Christian, and I've always felt it was one of her most profound statements. In most churches, most Adventists, in my experience, Reinder, have placed assent to doctrines and certain beliefs and certain lifestyle actions above actually behaving in the loving and Christian ways. We haven't been very good at opening our communities. We've been very good at spreading our doctrines and teaching them, but not very good at opening our communities. I'm going to, before I bring my professor, Bob Johnston, here, I'm going to ask you a question that was asked in the chat that I thought was useful that nobody's mentioned yet. What's the attitude like about LGBTQ people in Europe? Is it the similar sort of struggle that we have here with some more conservative people really rejecting them and others being very open to them?
Yes, I think the situation is quite similar.
Okay.
And by and large, anything official is not very promising. Mm-hmm. Leaders are very, very careful. But there are, fortunately, local churches that are more open than they used to be. And it has helped that also more people have really come out of the closet. And there is more knowledge now about having a different sexual orientation. So for many, it is, okay, I don't know really what I must do with these Bible texts, but it cannot be right to push these people away.
Right.
And so that is the de facto, I think, reaction of many people in the church. And but we have a long way to go.
Right. In 2015, when the NAD voted the statement that basically said people have a homosexual orientation or a gender dysphoria or whatever you want, whatever the particular quality is that they were talking about. people were shocked. Some people were just horrified that the church, the NAD, would vote such a thing. On the other hand, there were a lot of people who said, yeah, but it doesn't go far enough. And yet, if you had told me 20, 30 years, 40 years ago when I started my ministry that we ever would have admitted that, I would have been shocked. So there actually is some progress. It's kind of interesting. Dr. Johnston, come in on this now. I've got you on screen.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, it's a question for Dr. Bruinsma. I have been under the impression that the German-speaking church is quite polarized, and that Friedensau is a kind of a center for progressive Adventism and Bogenhofen for conservative Adventism. Is that true? And is that true in other countries? I've heard that in countries during the communist time, like Hungary, and of course in Russia, you had Vladimir Shelkhov and the True and Free Adventists and that sort of thing, that there's a lot of polarization there. Is it true that you have that kind of polarization in some of the countries? And is it diminishing or growing? I have a second question, if you don't mind. And that is, what about the youth? Are they all just leaving the church? Or are they a reason for hope in the future? I've seen some presentations by Petra Cinchala here at Andrews, who of course came from the Czech Republic, and seeing some of the things he's shown about what they've done for young people in Prague and elsewhere in the Czech Republic. And it looked quite hopeful, but I don't know how general that is. So if you could address either of those questions, that would be fine.
There is certainly an undesirable kind of polarization. And it is partly, I think, real, and it's partly also perception. What you see in the German world is quite true. That Friedensau is seen as quite progressive, liberal, whatever term, but these terms are not used by many in a very positive way. And Bogenhofen has traditionally been a stronghold of ATS and of a much more conservative kind of Adventism. It's one of the places in Europe where I've never been. And I have never been invited to do anything at Bogenhofen. Well, maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but yeah, I have met quite a few people from Bogenhofen at meetings. And then on a personal level, you know, you wonder, are these people really as conservative as they are sometimes made out to be? And the same is true when you are in contact with the people from Friedensau. And certainly in the last few years, I've been in very frequent contact with people at Friedensau. And then I have not noticed that they are so terribly liberal as they are sometimes made out to be. So I believe it's partly perception. It's something that has grown and that people believe. And but it is real. And there are, for instance, the South German Union, or rather the conference of which Bavaria is the main center. They don't hire pastors from Friedensau. They will only hire pastors who come from Bogenhofen. And of course, there are also similar things, for instance, in Great Britain, where there is sometimes hesitance to hire pastors that come from Newbold, because that is supposed to be maybe too liberal, whereas some other places in the world, Oakwood, Caribbean, they're much safer to get your pastors from. And now, I believe, and this is happening also in some other places, and that is to a large extent, there is some truth in it, but it's also perception, it's also rumors that go around, and that are very difficult to stop. And in Central Eastern Europe, I know less about it, but of course, the situation in Hungary, for instance, had very much to do with how we related to the state during the communist predominance. And that led to having two kinds of Adventism and to two different also theological schools. Now, to a large extent, that schism has been healed. And it's been difficult, but I think we must give great credit to the way the leaders in Hungary have dealt with that. And to a large extent, that difference, it's still there. And pastors come from a certain orientation. But they have taken some initiatives to really bring them together. And I don't feel that it's such a problem if people think differently, and if you have some different ways, you know, the one being more liberal and the other being more conservative, as long as we respect one another and are willing to talk to each other. And that is one of the responsibilities of leadership, to create the kind of sphere where that can happen. And that is insufficiently happening. Now,
Bruinsma, I'm just gonna bring in another voice here, if you don't mind. This is Martin Altink.
Yeah, but let me answer the second question that Dr. Johnson had, maybe, about whether there is hope with regard to our youth. May I say a quick word about that? I think there is hope, and there is hope in particular when you see a group of people who are not really wondering all the time what the brethren are saying and what the details are of the 28 fundamental beliefs, but they want a kind of Christianity that is practical, and which they are asking us to actually model for them. At the same time, it is true that too many are leaving, and it's also true that there is a growing group of rather conservative young people, and that is perhaps most worrying. And how to reach them, I don't know how we can deal with that.
Well, let's bring in Pastor Altink from Hamburg, young pastor here. He wrote me a little note here and said, I'd like to join in on the youth in Europe question. So go ahead, Martin.
Yeah. Well, I know Martin. You know, he has. He was one of our promising pastors in the Netherlands, but he felt that other pastures were greener for some reason. So he left for Germany. Hello,
yes,
Martin.
I'm sorry, Reinder. Hi.
Hi.
Nice to meet you here. Yes, I was just responding to one of the questions in the chat. Also, and there, what I experienced as a pastor here in Hamburg, particularly, is a lot of young people who are. They don't lose their faith. However, they are switching to another church. I don't know, probably it's not known in the rest of Europe. When I lived in the Netherlands, I've never heard of this church, ICF Church. Probably those of us who are from Germany did hear about this church, and they are very successful in actually drawing youth to their church. Their theology is stricter as to our church. And in that way, it is interesting to see actually liberal young people moving towards them. And I think the secret behind it is not so much the theology which they are spreading. However, it is the way they approach the other people. It is the way they approach the young people. They let them feel welcome, and know how to build up a relationship. And this is what I notice we as Adventists have difficulties with, in how to build up these relationships, not only with our young people, but particularly with our young people. And therefore, I also already said in the chat, I love the program which is built up here in the EUD, ICOR, probably also known to you, Reinder, Church of Refuge, where the main idea behind it is that not our 28 fundamentals should be in the center of our faith, but our relationships towards each other should be in the center of our faith. And I believe that is much more like Jesus did.
When that was first announced, I was very excited about it. But it's interesting, Martin, that it's gotten traction over there. It hasn't gotten traction over here, and I don't understand why. The concept that here's a safe church for a young person in itself seems to be like it would be a very good idea. Lynn, I apologize to you. I brought you on because you were next in line, and then other people have been coming in with precise questions on items that Reinder mentioned, and I'm going to bring in Wolfie here and ask you to unmute. He wanted to engage you too, Reinder, on introduce yourself, by the way, Wolfie.
Thank you. My name is Wolfgang Dorn. Wolfie, I'm the president of the Bavarian conference in Germany. I'm just following the discussion on a drip, and I have a battery run out. Unfortunately, if I have to leave, please apologize me. I just wanted to add that the Bavarian church is more a balanced church in the South German Union. And what I observe and what I can see during the last years, that the fragmentation, at least in the German field, we have six conferences, is becoming more and more towards a more tolerance attitude to each other. So the presidents are quite accepting to each other, even in Baden-Württemberg conference, which is traditionally a more conservative conference. But I can support the view of the Romanians. We have a strong influence of Romanian Adventists, especially in South Germany, and German Russians, and they changed the church, really, the Adventist church, really towards a very, very conservative view of Adventism. So just thank you for giving me this room of speaking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wolfie. And I just wrote you a little note here. I want to get your email or a connection with you on Facebook, because I'd like to.
And I think it's good that you corrected me, because when I said Bavaria, I really referred to the Baden-Württemberg conference. But then I really also realize we are always speaking in generalities. We are deep people there and deep people there, whereas it's a mixed bag in most places. But I think it would be true to say that the South German Union has been different in some ways from the North German Union. But it relates also to the fact, which I mentioned at the beginning, that the north of Germany has Protestant roots, whereas the south of Germany has more Catholic roots. Wouldn't that be true to say?
Yes, I would agree on this with you. As you might have heard, that the North German Union accepted the ordination of female pastors. So now this discussion is coming to the South German Union, and especially in Bavaria, we are facing a constituency meeting in 2 weeks, and our pastors raised a motion to ordain immediately female pastors. So the Bavarian Conference, in fact, is a conference which has most of all female pastors in Germany. And what we face here is a huge issue of discrimination of female pastors, ordained or not ordained, not ordained traditionally, of course, until now. But that's really shocking, very shocking. And we have especially Romanian churches which do not accept that pastors, female pastors, speak in front of the church, and reject leaders, deacons, and female church leaders. That are the issues we are facing at the moment on the administration level. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
I have the privilege of knowing both the president of the South German Union and of the North German Union very well. And I know how they are united on most of the issues. And I'm delighted to hear about the prospect that maybe the Bavarian Conference will decide to ordain one of their pastors. Just this last week in the Dutch press, there has been a lot of discussion about sexism in the Protestant churches in general in the Netherlands. And even in those churches like the United Protestant Church of the Netherlands, where they have many female pastors, still 3/4 of them experience that they are not taken seriously, or that there are still problems in being totally accepted. So that is not just something that we struggle with. But the question is, are we making, are we progressing, or are we solving some of these issues, or is it getting worse? All right.
We have an odd little custom here, and that is that because we originally announced our class for 2 hours, we always have a benediction at 3:30, and then we keep talking. And I try to figure that out, but we call it talking in the lobby or talking in the narthex. So Martin, would you be so kind as to give us a benediction in, you can choose German or Dutch, either one you want. We like to hear that God speaks other languages here. Would you be so kind?
Yes, of course. May the Lord bless us in all the things we do. May the Lord bless us in the thoughts that we have. And may the Lord bless us in the influence that we have in our world, so that we can reach everyone here in this world with your love and your care. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much. I'm going to finally bring you on in, Lynn, and I apologize that you've had to pose here on the screen for all this time, and I'm going to unpin Martin and Wolfie and go ahead. And Lynn has spent a lot of time in many places in the world. So Lynn, come in on this conversation.
Well, thank you for the presentation, Reinder. You pushed a lot of buttons for me, because my first experience abroad was at Bogenhofen, and then I did had quite a bit of experience running around in Europe, and particularly in northern Germany. And I always went to the churches there. To hear about the changes from these 1970s when I was doing that till now is quite interesting. But yeah, the idea that everybody, has this impression of certain institutions, I would second. In Bogenhofen, you talked about the Christmas tradition of Christmas tree. Well, I think we had a Christmas tree there in spite of the fact that it's supposed to be so conservative. And also, when I was there, they practiced the tradition that 1 year at least of the Krampus, which is like a guy with horns, almost a satanic character. So it wasn't officially from the institution, but people there did it. And so I was also spent some time at Friedenau, and there are a lot of conservative people there too. So a second your observation. I spent about 8 years in Southern Africa. We had graduates from Bogenhofen and Friedenau come down there to study theology. And one of those happens to be the president, I think, of a Northern German conference. I won't mention his name, but he shocked some of the Africans, especially the Afrikaners, by swimming one Sabbath afternoon when we went on a hike. So this idea of variety or the idea that we have so many different things within the church is not just a European thing. Obviously, the Europeans have spread all over the world, and I also understand that the Americans are now going to the Europeans. Isn't it true? Is Wolfie still there? Yes. Isn't it true that in Regensburg there's an American pastor? I think there is. I think I saw that somewhere. So I don't know how that happened, because my impression of him, he was not a conservative guy.
You're
It looks like he had to take off. But my question, actually, my comment and analysis of this, Reinder, is that this is fodder for anthropologists and sociologists. I'm not really an expert in either of those areas. There are other people here, I'm sure, who are. But I have studied organizational structures and organizational strategy. And really what we have here is an organizational strategy. And with organizations, we're an organization in order to do something. And organizations are always unified around a mission. And if you know anything about strategic management, you will know that it's always a losing strategy to be better or to have growth. It seems like we've been following losing strategies in this church. The winning strategy is to know your niche and to do it best. And I think we could isolate that if we wanted to, but I don't think we ever have. We measure things like growth. We measure things like tithe. I just don't think we've got a winning strategy as an organization to be effective in spreading and sharing the love of God as we should. To me, that's the mission, and being very practical about it. And it seems to me that we ought to be looking not just at the cultural things. These are interesting stories that we talk about, but there are things that cross culture. I had the pleasure of teaching with a Rwandan professor in South Africa, and he said we did a disservice to our students at the university in Rwanda when we did not teach them that the love of God crossed all barriers. And I believe that we've been following a losing strategy. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Reinder, do you want to speak before I turn to Francis?
No, I can only agree with what Lynn just said, and no, okay, I'm fully with it. Yeah.
It strikes me, Reinder, as you were speaking about one school has this reputation, the other has this reputation. When we went from the Midwest to California years ago, 35 years ago, people said, "Oh, you're going to California. It is so liberal out there. People are just terrible." Well, we found that the rumors were greatly exaggerated. We found very conservative people there too, good Seventh Adventist people who loved the church, and we found some liberal. And we actually didn't find the reputation was there, but we didn't actually find that the proportions of very liberal and very conservative people were very much different from they were when we came from. So it is kind of interesting that we tend to generalize, don't we? Frances, I've made you wait so long, and I apologize. Frances and her husband are wonderful supporters of Adventist Today, and I've been wanting to meet them in person every time we come to California, and we've never managed to do it. Frances is very involved in women's ministries down in Southern California, Reinder, and publishes a newsletter. So go ahead, Frances, and speak to us.
So I knew you knew what I wanted to talk about because you didn't mention women in the ministry in your first presentation. Since then, you have added some things. But when you first said, I got excited when you said we need workers in these countries. I thought, oh, good, maybe there's an opening for women in the ministry. But it sounds like there isn't. Are women ordained in any of those countries? And just what is the situation?
I was more hopeful maybe 10 years ago than I'm today. It seemed that some of our leaders in Western Europe were willing to move on, whereas many of them have gotten cold feet. And there has been such a pressure coming from the General Conference, and also, in all fairness, from the divisions, where, you know, the general tendency was to say, yes, we agree with you in principle, we should ordain women, but please be patient. Let's go together. Let's not make create chaos, because that was what many people were afraid of. And so Norway, for instance, decided that they would no longer ordain anyone. But of course, that was not good enough for the General Conference. The Netherlands Union went ahead and ordained a few women, but then also got cold feet, and actually have now ordination again on hold. It's encouraging that North Germany is now willing to go ahead. And what we just heard about Bavaria, that was a piece of good news. But well, to sum it up, I'm not quite as hopeful maybe as I was 10 years ago that it will be solved quickly. On the other hand, the COVID situation may just have helped us significantly in that, and I repeat what I just said, that the words of the GC probably matter less to many church members now than they did not very long ago. And my hope is that there will be some more unions coming across, and that a certain momentum can be created, and that simply the GC will give up. In my view, the most unfortunate thing was that it was ever brought to a vote whether we should ordain women, yes or no. If we had never voted about it, it would gradually have come about. In some places a little quicker than in some other places, but it had just happened, as so many things have happened in the church. But once you go the path that we have gone, it's very difficult to correct. But you know, maybe there will be other leadership at the top. Who knows? I certainly hope so.
That's what I pray for.
Yeah.
Are they doing the same thing in other countries that they're doing here? They're using women as pastors. They do the full work, but they're not receiving the payment because they haven't been ordained, and they're held back from advancement in the church hierarchy because they haven't been ordained. And some of them can't even find work outside of Adventist institutions because whoever heard of commissioning?
Well, as far as I know, there is no differential in payment in Europe. And that would actually be against the law in most places.
Francis, there isn't here either.
There is no differentiating. There's no differentiating in payment.
No, a commissioned pastor who is on an ordination track, it's the same amount as a pastor. There's a differential in terms of how many years you have. You start out at a lower level, but
sure,
a woman who had as many years in as I would get the same amount of money. However, you are correct in that there is a difference in whether you can ascend in leadership here in the United States for the most part, except in California, Pacific Union, and parts of Columbia Union.
But then I think more and more people realize that we have really gone a very strange route, that you can actually have the president of a university which has the prime theological school in the denomination, Andrews, and there the president is a woman. And, you know, there's something illogical. And we have a vice president of the General Conference who is a woman. And how is it that you can have a vice president of the GC, but you cannot have a president of a conference, according to the rule book? And I think we should actually give more information about it, make the people aware more than we do about how foolish it is, and that we really need to get our act together.
I tend to think, Reinder, that has not so much to do as policy as power and authority. Be able to say, somebody in a certain office being able to say, I can stop you from this. I have control and I have power. I'm going to turn to my friend Karsten. Hi, Karsten. I haven't seen you for a while. I hope you and your family are well. You look like you're sitting at the ocean at sunset, so I'll let you.
It's a picture that I use as a fake background taken at midnight. I just want to inject a little optimism note. First of all, Reinder, your comments about your view of Europe, I'm 100% in agreement with you, seen from the Scandinavian/Danish perspective. It's very, very similar. And COVID has done one marvelous thing, I think, in our minds collectively. The General Conference has just disappeared from our consciousness. I lived in Texas from 1993 to 2000. And when I came back to Denmark, I thought that our local church would be dying out. Then something strange happened. And that's what I'd like to tell you about. I remember you visited us in Narum many years ago and talked about the 3 Bs, Reinder, the belonging, the believing, and then the behaving, in that order. And there was a couple of parents in the church who felt that we were losing too many young people. So they decided to create not a new Sabbath school class, but a morning get-together Sabbath morning called Pit Stop. Now that's a wild name. And part of that is the Danish tradition of having morning bread with Danish pastries and orange juice and croissant and all that other good stuff. And they get together and they start by enjoying the morning brunch, or whatever you want to call it. And later on, we found that there were a lot of people that were coming from our boarding academy in Vejlefjord in Western Denmark, then coming to the Copenhagen area and studying medicine or engineering or other, university type educations. And they had no place to land. There was no church that really suited their profile. So we decided to make the Narum Church a landing spot for them. And the young people there at the boarding academy, they're used to taking leadership roles in the church and singing and leading church services and being elders and so on. So we decided to tell them that they will be very welcome in our church And two of the young people from there were, I guess we didn't ordain them, but they were elected as elders, you know, for 20-year-old kids, which was revolutionary for people that young, although they probably hadn't read their Adventist history about how old Ellen and James White were when they started the rebellion.
Absolutely.
But the nice thing about that is that they felt at home, they felt accepted. And we have a very broad age span going up to the mid-90s in our church. They felt that everybody loved them. They're a very musical group of people. We, a couple of years ago, bought a beautiful new grand piano. Several of them were excellent pianists. Several of them sing a lot and so on. And even though we have a drum set in the church, they very rarely use it. It's very low-key, relaxing type music that spans all generations. And that has given me hope that maybe the next generation of the church, when us old grumpy old men die off, they will find their own way. They're not focused as that much on theology. They're not hung up about even women's ordination and so on. They found a place where they belong, where they're happy, where they're together, where they're accepted, and nobody raises a finger if they cohabitate and all those type of sinful things. So it may be that the problem will solve itself if we just let it. And we've discussed women's ordinations very, very little in the past few years. We still have the censure of the General Conference hanging over our heads. The conference has sent a letter to the GC about that and what needs to be done and so on. And there has been no reply. And I said, wonderful, let's just move on. Get a life.
That's great, Carsten. Thank you.
Yes, and you know, my wife and I, we hope to go to Denmark next month, and look forward to the pastry in Denmark. And maybe one of the Sabbaths we might come to the Adventist Church and see how you're doing. So thank you for injecting that note of optimism.
Good. And at the same time, I'm doing a road trip from starting in California next week for 3 weeks, driving all over the Western US. So we probably won't see you if you come in early July.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, Carsten. I appreciate that. You know, Reinder, I've often said the only church leader that I've had who actually added value to my ministry is a guy named Raj Adikan, who happens to be here on our class today. And one of the things I remember Raj saying so often was, one of the best things that a leader can do is to give permission to people. Simply give permission, that's all. Just give permission to do what seems right to you. And if there are problems, you help them solve problems, but at least give them permission. And I've always remembered that. I wish more of our leaders, rather than being so bossy, would give permission for people to do what seems best to them. I'm going to now turn to Yvonne Oster. Yvonne, I'm sorry, you've had to wait a long time, and
that's okay.
The nature of
okay. Interesting conversation. There are two things. This with liberal and conservative, you know, it depends on where you come from and maybe also which generation you are. But I remember when I was young, quite some time ago, I happened to sit in the West Danish Conference Board, and the chairman, or the president, you would say, he suggested someone with the application that this man was a good conservative Adventist. And my reaction, being in my late 20s, was, how can anybody be good when they are conservative? You know, I mean, I was born during the war, so I was in this 68 generation, you know. And to me, liberal was good and conservative was bad if you take the polarization. And I always wondered why we had this discussion about liberal and conservative in our church ever since. Because, I mean, you can be liberal on certain points and traditional or conservative on other points, the same person. So I think maybe we should delete that that kind of categorization within the church, I think it would be beneficial. The other thing I just want to say shortly, I think her name was Francis.
Francis,
Was that
yes.
right? Yes. In Sweden, we have had women preaching within the church and within other free churches for the last 100 years, also in the Adventist Church. Well, that doesn't mean that we have had ordained pastors. We still don't have, because of this kind of decision and censure we have from the GC. But we have had employed pastors, employed women, not as Bible workers, which we had in the 40s and 30s, 40s and 50s, but we have employed pastors since the beginning of the 1980s. And most of us have been graduates from Newell College, who at that time very much promoted us. We had wonderful teachers who really promoted us. But I feel that there was a change of times in the 1990 when the first vote in the General Conference was made on whether to ordain women or not. Up to that point, it was very optimistic, but since then, but still, young women, go for it. I gave advice to a young woman just a few weeks ago that, of course, she should go and study theology if she felt the call, and she will. So we have not given up hope, but I must say I'm not so optimistic it will happen in a lifetime. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. That was a lovely speech.
And it's good to see Yvonne, but I still think she is liberal.
Oh, okay. You and her can fight that out. I will say, Reinder, I just want to, I'm going to put up here on in the chat an article I wrote during the midst of the pandemic, where it's called "How the General Conference Lost Its Mojo," and it goes right along with what you said when you said that. I didn't do that right. Sorry, Charlie. When you said, I think the local churches have gained stature, and the church leadership has lost importance during the pandemic. I agree with you completely. I think the General Conference will never be or never have as much interest now as it used to before the pandemic. I think people are going to be much more oriented to local churches. Do you agree with me?
I'm sorry, Laura, and I was just trying to look at some of the stuff at the chat, and then I forgot to listen to you.
No, that's okay.
I'm sure I agree with you.
Yes, I'm sure we always agree, you and I. No, I was just saying you were right when you said that the church administration, the General Conference, and the other high parts of the church have somewhat faded during the pandemic. Their influence, they're not who they used to be, I don't think.
No.
I don't think anybody will ever attend to them at the same level that they used to. And I posted an article that I had written about that. It's called "How the General Conference Has Lost Its Mojo." So I think they've become somewhat irrelevant and will never regain their relevance again. By the way, before we finish, Reinder, I would like to recommend an article to you and to the others. You had started out by somewhat of a generalization about American religion. A wonderful article in the Atlantic Monthly of, this would be the April Atlantic Monthly, called America. Oh, wait, I gotta change this. Stop video. It doesn't want to let me show it. I would recommend that you go online and look at this article, America Without God. Interestingly, this is from the Atlantic Monthly. Interestingly, Reinder, he quotes as one of his authorities, one of your countrymen, Abraham Kuyper. Kuyper, do you say, or Kuyper?
Yes,
Kuyper.
Kuiper, yeah, Kuiper.
A theologian who served as the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. Kuyper said that all strongly held ideologies were effectively faith-based, and no human being could survive long without some ultimate loyalty.
Mhm.
The loyalty didn't derive from traditional religion. It would find expression through secular commitments such as nationalism, socialism, or liberalism. The political theorist Samuel Goldman calls this the law of the conservation of religion. In any given society, there is a relatively constant and finite supply of religious conviction. What varies is how and where it is expressed. And the author of this article, which I highly recommend to you, basically says that in America, what has happened is that as religion has declined, politics has become a religion, and this accounts for the faith that people have in people like Donald Trump. So I see. Thank you, Martin. Martin just posted the link here, and I hope that all of you might read this. You know, Reinder, I'm so anxious to come to. I'm so eager to come to Netherlands and meet you in person, because every time you speak, I am so blessed and impressed with your thoughtfulness and your breadth. And I want to thank you very much for being here again today. And I will look forward again to the next time that you join us and can speak with us. Our time is up. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We've kept 125 people. We're up to around 100, or sign-ins. We're up to around 160, 170 at the top. And we still have 125 of you here. And thank you so much. Please go to the Adventist Today website and look at some of the things we've posted there. By the way, you will be very interested in something I just put up last night by a young African, very interesting guy, who is explaining ancestor worship and how ancestor veneration really is not that different, not that opposed to Christianity. You'd be interested in that, Dr. Bruinsma. And you have done a wonderful job in speaking to us today. I want to say goodbye to all of you. So long. And thank you so much, Dr. Bruinsma, especially. I'm looking forward to my trip to the Netherlands, and you and I are going to have a good, long conversation. Thank you very much.
We are looking forward to having you here.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody. God bless.
Thank you for having me tonight, and blessings to everybody. Bye-bye.